But today I want to talk to you about proof-theoretic pluralism, harmony, and identity. So probably many of you have talked to stewards, so many of you have talked about pluralism. Well, why don't I just start? Logical pluralism, right, is the view that there could be more than one correct logic, or right logic, or legitimate logic. There's like a whole debate there that I'm basically going to ignore. But the idea is roughly that if we think of logic as modeling ways of reasoning, then there might be more than one good way to reason in some given situation, right? This has taken on a lot of life in recent years, I guess, maybe not so recent anymore. But there was all this work that J.C. Beale did, who was here a while ago. Michael and Stewart have both had big hands in it, and a variety of things like that. What I want to focus on today is a proof-theoretic version of pluralism, right? So these ideas, by and large, at least, well, that's not even true anymore. When I first started giving this talk 5 years ago, these ideas, by and large, have been mostly model theoretic. Now there's more and more proof theory about it. But what I want to tell you about is a paper that Restall wrote about accommodating a logical pluralism within a proof theory. And the big thing for Restall was that he wanted it to be a pluralism of like the consequence relation simpliciter that wasn't derivative on a pluralism in the meanings of the logical connectives, right? So that was the big push there. 9 years ago now, holy cow, I wrote a response to that, claiming basically that he couldn't play the game the way he wanted it to and still get all the logics he wanted. Ferrari and Orlandelli have since published a rejoinder to that explaining how you could, right? So I am largely on board with the work that Ferrari and Orlandelli did. I think it's cool. I think it moves things forward. In fact, what I'm going to tell you today is that it didn't move things forward far enough, right? They stopped short of the potential pluralism that they could have had. And so the big solution here is that we're going to sort of loosen their restrictions and wind up with more pluralism. So yay, everyone wins. The more the merrier. But let me tell you about it. So, well, I just did the introduction, but I want to tell you a little bit about the debate at stake here, and then tell you 2 ways that we might loosen the Ferrari and Orlandelli solution, right? I'm going to propose a number of definitions of uniqueness on their view, and then a variety of definitions on harmony. I think both of these ways still preserve the core of what they're looking for, but get us that extra sort of move. And then I'm going to show you that they ought to be okay with that. So here is sort of the crux of Restall's proof-theoretic pluralism, right? Restall proposes that any sequent where we have sets of sentences, we can read gamma turnstile delta as every evaluation which takes every element of gamma to be true, takes some element of delta to be true, right? So you've got an every on one side, some on the other. This is, I think, a pretty typical reading of the sequent. And Restall also has a pretty typical set of rules, right? I'm not going to go through them all. The one we're going to talk about actually is maybe the simplest one. We're going to spend most of our time today talking about the identity rule. And why we maybe might want to give that up sometimes, which is, well, we'll see if I can get you on board at that point. Okay, but here is what Restall does, right? So Restall takes this sort of situation and says, okay, let's let the meanings of the connectives be given by their left and right logical rules, right? So if we go back to the connective rules, then the meaning of negation is going to be given by not L and not R, right? So this movement of negation across the turnstile. Similarly, the meaning of and is going to be given by and L and R, or the meaning of or by or L and R, right? These are the meaning constitutive terms, or the rules constitute the meanings of these connectives. So what Restall then does is he says, well, okay, if we can take the connectives to be defined in that particular way, then if we make other changes to the logical system that don't affect those rules, then we don't we've sort of generated a pluralism that doesn't necessarily have connective meanings that shift, right? So for Restall, then different logics are obtained by varying the structural rules, right? So we might add or remove a weakening rule or a cut rule or the one that lets you mix up the order of things, whose name, of course, I've forgotten, but yeah. In that case, then we would get something like intuitionistic logic. In the 2014 paper, he discusses this by restricting the number of formulas on the right-hand side of the sequence. He discusses dual intuitionistic logic by restricting the number of formulas on the left. And since the left and right logical rules remain the same in both of these cases, right, we haven't altered those rules. The connectives are the same, and now we have three logics in this system where the connective meanings are the same. So we've got the pluralism that Restall is after, right? Here we have multiple logics in a system. The variance doesn't come from a variance in the meanings of the connectives, and so we're good to go. There's really interesting work being done these days on whether the types of restrictions that Restall is talking about here don't actually sort of trickle down to the operational rules, so the connective defining rules, because if you might wonder whether like the and L rule is the same if you have only one thing on the right. Yeah, we don't need to concern ourselves with that now, but just to sort of flag it as something that's out there in the literature that could be interesting to explore. Okay. So in the paper then, in the 2014 paper, Restall does intuitionistic and dual intuitionistic logic. I think Restall is the type of guy who wants relevance logics in his system, right? There's a book on substructural logics that he wrote. If he doesn't want relevance logics, then none of us want relevance logics. So usually this is obtained by omitting the weakening rules, right? If you get rid of the weakening rules, then you can get a relevant system, because then your premises have to have the right relations to, or your conclusions have to have the right types of relations to your premises, right? If this works out, then the left and right logical rules remain the same, and the connectives in all three logics are the same, so we're set. In 2016, I claimed that this doesn't actually work out. In order to remove the weakening rules, we do have to make the kinds of substantive changes to the way that Restall interpreted the sequence that he would think of as problematic, right? So in order to remove the weakening rules, we have to make it the case that we can't smuggle weakening back in. But as it stands, we're reading the connective as if everything on the left is true, then something on the right is true. Right, so you can presumably add things on the right and still not affect the reading of the connective, right? This is a problem for Restall, right? Because it means that we can't get a relevance logic into this system. We would really like a relevance logic in this system. In all the model theoretic work that Restall has done, he's included relevant logic, so we should have it here, right? The goal of this was to sort of reflect how we could do this kind of pluralism in a proof-theoretic setting. But I said we couldn't. Okay, so that brings us up to 9 years ago now. So let's jump ahead to 6 years ago, right? So Ferrari and Orlandelli have this really nice response, right? They claim that both Restall and I are making the same mistake, right? We are imparting too much model theory into our proof theory. And the whole point here was to get rid of the model theory to begin with, because we were wanting to show that this could be done in a purely proof-theoretic setting. Okay, what do they propose then? They suggest that we reinterpret the sequence, right? We're no longer going to assume that the sequence means that if everything on the left is true, then something on the right is true. Instead, we're going to assume that it means that the sequence is true if and only if the cases in delta follow from the assumptions in gamma. Okay. I don't know what a case is. I'm sorry. They say that it's standard, so we're going to go ahead and pretend it's standard. It could be that there's another argument to be made here about defining what a case is, and having to lay out the right kind of background for that might impart the same kind of problems that I pointed to originally, or that Restall was trying to solve, or something like this. I don't know, but I think there's sort of an interesting way to move forward with this, even if we sort of ignore that potential issue. So it's not enough to just have it be the case that we can read a sequence in a particular way, right? Because we don't want just a random collections of sequence to count as legitimate logics. That would seem to not, if that counted as a logic on our pluralism, that's like a bad making feature of our pluralism. Right? So in addition, they impose a harmony constraint, right? So for Ferrari and Orlandelli, a logic is admissible to their pluralism if it can be read, if the sequence can be read as the cases in delta follow from gamma, and its connectives are harmonious, but they're harmonious in a really particular way. Okay? They claim it's Belknap harmony and it's not. So it's a variant of a kind of Belknap take on harmony. For them, connectives have to be unique, right? What that means is that two notational variants are going to be interderivable. And notational variance is another place where, like, as far as I can tell, no one really knows what notational variants are. I think the best explanation of it is a Stephen Reed paper where he says, basically, I know them when I see them. So that's what we're rolling with here, right? If you can switch out the symbols in one of them for the other symbols, then that's probably a notational variant. And they've got to be conservative, right? So the rules for any given connective don't allow us to prove anything new about the language without that connective. If you're adding a new connective, it doesn't generate new stuff unless that new stuff features the new connective you're adding. We're going to call this FO harmony. An older version of this paper called this Belknap harmony, but I've been pretty convinced that it's in particular the interderivability as uniqueness, I don't think is exactly what Belknap had in mind, and what Ferrari and Orlandelli get here is a little bit stronger, actually. So here's FO harmony then, right? You have a system that's FO harmonious when two notational variants of any connective are interderivable, and when adding new stuff doesn't mess with the old stuff. All right. So where does that get us then? Well, given the rules from the Restall 2014 paper, classical, intuitionistic, and relevant logic are harmonious, and their sequence can be read in the appropriate way, right? We can say that the cases in delta follow from the cases. Okay? So this is a good candidate then for a proof-theoretic pluralism where the connectives mean the same thing, but where we get all of our desired logics. Yeah, the arguments I made in that 2014 paper said basically that you didn't get the relevant logic, and so you couldn't move forward in this way. Now we've got a system to do it. Okay? And in this sense, I think they're largely right, actually. Yeah, we've got a system that does the thing we want. It's balanced in the right kinds of ways, so it has this nice harmony constraint, so you know you're not going to be adding things like Tonk or other kind of chaos makers, so that's nice. And you've got a lot more logics now, right? We've got a sort of more proof-theoretic motivation for this pluralism. We don't have to think about truth in this case. We can think about cases, whatever those are, right? And they argue in the paper that this means that they've got a two-level pluralism, right? So they have pluralism at the level of validity, right? We've just shown it. Okay, the classical, intuitionistic, and relevant logics can all be described with those operational rules that Restall gave. And you switch between logics by adjusting the structural rules, right? So that's great. And then you also can vary the operational rules if you want. So do you want a system with like a stranger negation? Go to town, right? We'll just have another family of logics. You know? So now we're getting kind of families of pluralism where the connectives have the same meaning, but then there's this one like overarching kind of admissibility condition, right? You have your sequence have to be read in a particular way, and you have to be harmonious in a particular way. Okay. Great. Yay. I actually think that this is like a really good way to go for this debate, and I'm a little bit bummed that I didn't think of it first. But I didn't. They also mention, though, and this is going to be kind of important for us in about 3 slides, they mention what they call a kind of Carnapian motivation for this. So Carnap's pluralism is often thought as one where the admissibility conditions, right? We've been talking about admitting logics into our system on the basis of whether they're harmonious and have sequence that sort of work in the right kinds of ways. The admissibility conditions for Carnap tend to be more like you can formalize it and it does good things for you. And Ferrari and Orlandelli say that this is part of their motivation here, right? They want logics to be useful in the right kinds of ways. They want to be called a principle of tolerance. I don't know how much time with Stuart y'all have had, but if I'm saying too many things too many times, let me know. It's called the principle of tolerance, right? You basically want to be tolerant of these other kinds of systems. You let people go work in their preferred system, and you don't yuck their yum, right? But you can go ahead and work in yours as long as you can explain it with the appropriate kinds of rules and it does good work for you. You want it to be useful. Yeah. So given that Ferrari and Orlandelli think that these logics should be useful, I think we can sort of push their system a little bit to get even more useful logics. And if we're building a toolbox full of useful stuff, why not put more stuff into it, right? So let's see how that works. Okay, what I need to tell you about first is the notion of uniqueness that Ferrari and Orlandelli use, right? Because it is particular and it is strong. Notably for them, if a connective is a notational variant of the other, you need to be able to show that those are interderivable. Okay. So you need to be able to describe or derive both sequence that we've got here, right? Which requires producing an explicit proof for each of these. Yeah. And that's a lot. So look, here's an example of a hook and arrow being interderivable, right? If I assume that the arrow LMR rules are as I described before, and the hook LMR rules are exactly like those, except I've switched out the arrow for the hook. Then here's the proofs of each of those. You start with the identity rule, and you put it all together, and then flip it over. That's not really a very detailed explanation of them, but they're not terribly complicated proofs, right? Because it's just two connectives using exactly the same rules as motivation. Okay. So that's great. Here's the deal, and this is where identity is going to come in for us, right? The identity rule that expresses reflexivity has been used in proving uniqueness of the operators, and we don't know whether it would be possible to prove uniqueness without it. In fact, it would not be possible to prove uniqueness without it, because we couldn't even start the interderivability proofs that they want, right? What did we need to do to prove that these two sequences were interderivable? Well, we needed to start somewhere. And the only place in this system that we have available to us to start is with the identity. So if we don't have that, then we don't have anything. Okay. This, I'm going to tell you in a second, is going to rule out some logics that we would like. Some useful logics that could be fruitful and produce good things. Right? And that might be a bit surprising because we don't usually think of things without identity as being good logics, but let me tell you about one. Right? So French in 2016, and I think there's a follow-up paper where he proves a bunch of additional results, talks about resolving paradoxes. Right? And one way that he suggests we might resolve paradoxes is to simply get rid of the identity. Right? The identity rule basically allows us to smuggle in this kind of self-reference almost, right? So if A is the liar sentence, I don't want to be able to say A, therefore A, yeah? Because then I'm winding up in this contradictory place. So if I rule out that move in general, then some of these sentences might not be so paradoxical. It seems really, really wild, I think, to think about a system where A doesn't prove A, but it's not as bad as it's. Right? There are other places where we might want this kind of move to be available, right? So if we think of our logic as preserving something like true in virtue of, right? We don't think of it as preserving truth simpliciter, but as preserving sort of the relationships about what things are true in virtue of others. Then it might be the case that for some things, maybe axioms, I don't know, it depends on how you think about it, a sentence is true in virtue of itself, right? And that would be effectively what the identity rule would state in the system. But that's definitely not going to be the case for all of the things we're concerned about. So if we're wanting to preserve things, if we're wanting to think about true in virtue of, then we're going to want a system without the identity rule. Similarly, if we're wanting to think of heterogeneous logic. So heterogeneous logics are logics which work in more than one language. So you might have one language on the left side of the turnstile and a different language on the right side of the turnstile. If we're wanting to work in terms of that, then certainly it's not the case that a turnstile A should be true because you'd have something in the wrong language on the other side of the turnstile. Right? It just wouldn't even be grammatical. Okay, so not so far-fetched. What's next? Okay. So LKR then is just the complete set of rules from Russell 2014 that we looked at the beginning of the talk, minus the identity. So we're just dropping one of these structural rules. We've been doing that the whole time, right? We thought about dropping weakening, we thought about restricting the number of sequences on the left and right, now we're dropping another. It is strange though, it's got no valid sequence. Because you can't prove anything, right? It's not as bad as it sounds, because there are a ton of valid meta-sequence, right? So meta-sequence are a higher order sequence, which has sets of sequences their premises and sequences their conclusion, right? So you can basically prove things about the relationships between sequences. And that's where the work in this logical system happens. A meta-sequence can also be valid, right? If there's an LKR derivation whose end sequence is a conclusion and whose leaf sequence are all members of the premises of the meta-sequence, then we can have a valid meta-sequence. And so effectively, here's an example of a valid meta-sequence, right? If you have two identity sequence, then you can show that you can join them on the other end, right? Great. So we can prove some stuff, just like not at the object level. That's not too bad. That's cool, right? And look, oh wait, it's also useful. We can do stuff with this. We can solve some paradoxes. We can think about true and virtue of. We can think about what heterogeneous logics would look like, right? In this sense, these wind up then being useful. It's a useful logic to have in our toolkit if we can get it in. Yeah. As it stands right now, though, we can't, right? LKR does not have rules that can be proven to be unique, right? What we need to show that rules are unique is that they're interderivable. To show that they're interderivable, we have to show that we have those two valid sequence, right? A sequence going in both directions. We have no valid sequence, so we don't have unique rules. Okay. So it's not etho-harmonious, and it's not admissible by the lights of Ferrari and Orlandelli. But look, it should be. It's useful, and there are other ways that we can demonstrate that this is balanced in the right kind of way. Right? So if what we're after here then is an idea of useful balanced logics that we're admitting to our system, then we want to let this one in. Right? So what are we going to have to do? Well, we're going to have to adjust that definition of uniqueness that Ferrari and Orlandelli did. Right? The interderivability criteria is simply too strong for our purposes. Okay. Here's another option. So we might say that a connective is unique in a particular presentation of a logic, when if you've got a notational variant of it and you can derive a sequence containing one, then you can also derive a sequence containing the other. Okay. This means that we don't have to prove that we have those two valid sequences. We just have to prove that if we have a sequence having one, then we have a sequence. Okay. We can do this in LKR, right? So just because there are no valid sequences doesn't mean there are no good proofs. And so we can produce these kinds of proofs in LKR, and that would let us admit this as unique. Okay. This would mean that it would get to be counted on the Ferrari and Orlandelli picture, right? So we're going to let it in. We're going to say, okay, yes, it is useful. It is the type of thing that we want to keep around, and it is the type of thing we want to keep in our logic. And look, it's unique and conservative, although I haven't told you that, but it's conservative for the same reasons all the other ones we considered were, right? So it would come out as both harmonious and admissible on this picture, which is a nice feature, I think. The sort of more things we can get, the better off we are. Okay. That's still not enough, I claim. And this example is maybe a little more tenuous, so bear with me while I walk through it, and then I can tell you why it might not work out anyway. what we've done is sort of broadened or weakened the uniqueness criteria in such a way that we can let in more things by removing the requirement to have the valid sequence and replacing it with a requirement to have sort of two proofs. So if you have one proof, then you have the other, right? This is not going to work for certain other systems, right? So imagine the following. Imagine that you've got a Hilbert-style system, right, with two copies of each connective. So you're just going to duplicate all the rules for one with a little like subscript 2 as the rules for the other. Yeah. Here's the part that's totally a stretch. You might think this is useful for comparing different reasoning patterns or something like this, right? Maybe this is the type of thing that that might let us get that off the ground. I'm not totally sure. We also don't need it to show that we can extend the definition of uniqueness to get what we want. So I'm not like too worried about it. But this is not the type of system where if you have a proof with one connective, you can replace it with a proof of the other connective, right? You can't have those same kinds of proof relations, in large part because even though arrow sub 1 and arrow sub 2 are notational variants, they're not intersubstitutable in the right kinds of ways because we don't have any sentences with mixed connectives, right? The one connectives all stick with the one connectives, the two connectives all stick with the two connectives. So if I have a proof of a sentence that says like arrow sub 1, or like A arrow sub 1, not sub 1 B, right? I can't replace the arrow in that proof with an arrow sub 2 because then I've got an arrow sub 2 and a not sub 1 interacting, and that's just not something that we have let ourselves have on this system, right? So we might think then that like, actually we haven't gone far enough even yet. What we need to do at this point is continue to push the uniqueness criteria out further and further. On some days, I think that's like the best idea there is. And on other days, I think that maybe at some point you've got to stop and you've like pushed past something that might be uniqueness at all. I don't think that I need to take a stand on that here, though y'all might tell me differently, right? What we've sort of seen so far is that if we stick with Ferrari and Orlandelli's original definition of uniqueness, then we can't get some of the logics that we might have wanted. At the very least, we can't get LKR. Whether we want this Hilbert system, I don't know, right? But on the very basis of their sort of criteria, right, they talk about being motivated by these kind of Carnapian considerations and these considerations of balance. We're going to want to be able to admit these types of logics, I think. And we can't, but we should. So the more the merrier, I think. Okay. So assuming I've convinced you of that, we just like generate multiple definitions of uniqueness. There are lots more definitions of harmony than this Ferrari and Orlandelli definition. In fact, the more I read, the more definitions there seem to be. But at the very least, we have like the original Belknap harmony, which there's just a lot of literature on that. So I know at least some folks here know harmony better than I do. And if you know, I'd love to hear. But the original Belknap harmony, which may or may not be the Ferrari and Orlandelli one, it doesn't really matter. There's a sort of idea of normalization. There's a GE harmony that we could get here, right? There's like all kinds of other ways that we can achieve this balance, right? And why might we want that? Well, I've already kind of said this, but right, pluralism is usually or often, pluralism is sometimes motivated by this kind of idea of usefulness, right? At least for Ferrari and Orlandelli, I think they're not unique in thinking in this kind of Carnapian way. If it's a useful logic, I want to admit it to my pluralistic system so that I can make use of it in the places where it's best suited, right? Harmony adds for us this nice notion of balance, right? What do we get when we add a notion of harmony? Well, we get a balance between the connective rules. We wind up with a system that doesn't prove too much and that doesn't prove too little. So it sort of strikes this nice path down the center, right? And we know when we've got a harmonious system, in some sense of the term harmonious, that we are going to have a system that is constrained in the right kinds of ways. It's both open to do enough stuff that we can make use of it, and it's also constrained enough that we can't like admit tunnels and stuff like that, right? We can't trivialize the system. So this is truly lovely. And the thing I think we want, right? We want a logical pluralism that's going to admit good kind of logics. And here, this balance is a nice way to characterize that notion of good. Okay. Sorry, the screen is switching slightly after I switch my slides, and I keep being terribly surprised by it. So, let me tell you about one other type of harmony that we might add to this system, right? And this is sort of a surface level gloss on it, right? But we might add a sort of normalization requirement. Right? We could send the Ferrari and Orlandelli notion of harmony packing for a second. Let's instead replace it with normalization. Okay? If you've got, we're also going to switch, of course, to natural deduction just to make things more confusing, but introduction and elimination pairs for connectives, right? They look like they should go together. They should be related in the right kinds of ways. If we can, if in a proof we introduce a connective and then eliminate it sometime later on within that very same proof, it looks like we've used this connective in a way that's sort of illegitimate, right? It shows up in the middle and then disappears by the end. We shouldn't have needed to use that. That connective might be doing too much work for us, right? It might be bleeding into this kind of like the idea with conservativity, right, was that we wanted to keep connectives sort of in their own lanes. And if we're introducing one and then eliminating one, it might be doing too much work. A normalized proof rewrites this proof without the I and E pair, right? So rewrites the proof without the introduction and then elimination of the connective. A logical system itself is normalizable when there's a reduction procedure for each connective, right? A reduction procedure just takes an I and E pair and reduces the proof to one without it. Right? Great. Right. Normalization, though, and Belknap harmony come apart, right? So there are things that are normalizable that aren't, well, this says Belknap harmony, but that should actually say FO harmony because that's what we've been talking about so far, right? There are ways that these two come apart. So reductio, for example, can be leveled, it can be normalized. You can write a procedure to get rid of it, to get rid of introducing and eliminating it. But it's not conservative when added to classical logic, right? You can prove new things. So even though you're just adding this thing about negation, you wind up being able to prove new things in your system that you weren't able to prove before. Right? So this might then be another way that we can allow ourselves to have this kind of balance, right? Normalization is going to get us a different kind of balance between our rules than the kind of F and O harmony that we've been considering so far did. Then maybe it's a good kind of balance. If it's still letting us admit these systems that are sort of on an even keel, not proving too much, not proving too little, but at the same time letting us admit more systems, then that's great. We can get, I claim, more useful and balanced logics in this way, right? So one interesting thing is that if you add regular disjunction to a system with quantum disjunction and conjunction, then on the F and O picture, it sort of blows up and becomes not harmonious, but it can be normalized. So, and we might want a quantum disjunction around, yeah? I think people still might want a quantum disjunction around, but if we don't want that particular disjunction, we can come up with something else, right? These are still things that might be useful, and we've argued now that they're balanced also, and so Ferrari and Orlandelli should want them to be part of their original logical pluralism to begin with. Okay, so everything admitted is still balanced and useful, right? Adding this quantum disjunction would still be balanced and useful, it's just a different notion of balance, right? Adding LKR would still be useful and balanced, again, just a different notion of balance. So the suggestion then that I think pushes this debate to its sort of natural conclusion is that we don't actually have a two-level version of pluralism here, right? Ferrari and Orlandelli argued that they had a pluralism at the level of harmony and then at the level of connective meanings. And we're going to add a third one. We've now got a pluralism also at the level of admissibility, right? There's more than one way to be balanced and useful. And so there's a pluralism of ways that you can get into this pluralism to begin with. So we've actually got a 3-level pluralism instead of a 2-level. Okay. Everything's still okay though. We can add all of these logics and still not have to worry about the original Kouri 2016 worries or some worries that Ferrari and Orlandelli bring up, right? So the worries from my original paper still don't apply. Yeah. We still have a system in which we can have relevant intuitionistic and classical logic, right? It's just in that first system that Ferrari and Orlandelli described. So we've got their original definition of uniqueness. We've got their definition of conservativity. We've got the changes coming from the operational rules, not the structural rules. So the language is the same and the validity is different. All good there, right? More importantly, 3 of Ferrari and Orlandelli's original requirements, which are actually original requirements from Beal and Restall, also don't apply. So this system with this sort of extra level of pluralism at the level of balance and uniqueness, balance and usefulness, is still necessary and normative and formal in the right kinds of ways. So it's necessary. Well, here's Ferrari and Orlandelli's definition of necessity. The kind of relation between premises and conclusion that occurs solely in virtue of characteristics that are intrinsic to the deductive system in use and thus entirely independent of further extra-logical hypotheses that we may entertain and which are external to the system, right? It seems like if they've got that for their sequent calculus, then we've got that for all of the other systems that we've considered, right? We're not admitting extra logical things into consideration here. These are systems that are usually thought to be necessary in whatever sense of necessary you're using. So we're still good here. We're also still good on the normativity front. So the Beal and Restall definition of normativity, which Ferrari and Orlandelli adopt, is weak, right? All you need to be normative is that you somehow go wrong if you accept the premises and not the conclusion. So you can't accept the premises of something and reject the conclusion. That would be an error of some sort, right? They're not specific about what type of error. There is a whole boatload of work that has been done on this sort of status of normativity, well, before Beal and Restall and well after them. There's a bunch of really cool stuff coming out now on it and about these bridge principles and stuff like that. This isn't even so fancy as like a bridge principle, right? It's just a claim that like, you've made a mistake if you accept the premises and reject the conclusion. You can still make mistakes on our system, right? If you pick your logic and you don't reason in accordance with it, then you've made a mistake in the same kind of way. The more complicated one, or maybe just as easy, I waffle on this as well, is the notion of formality, right? So Ferrari and Orlandelli use Dawson's definition, according to which an operator is logical if it can ultimately be analyzed in structural terms, or it's logical if it represents some structural element of deduction. Sequent calculus rules have this property just by default, so LKR is good to go. That gets in automatically. We're going to need to change it for the other systems, right? If we do wind up admitting that Hilbert system, we'll need something slightly different here. But I don't know. I waffle on formality, right? On the one hand, it seems like, well, I've written it down in terms of symbols. And so there's like a pretty clear sense in which it's formal. If I showed it to my mother, she wouldn't be able to read it. So does that make it formal? I'm not sure. And on the other hand, there's like something, you know, that needs to be made really precise here. And so the argument here is that we're probably mostly good on this. We might have to muck with the definition of formality a little bit to get it, but it looks like what we've presented are formal systems. And so in the same way that I know a notational variant when I see it, you might just know a formal system. See. All right, so what have we done then? We have now a pluralism at the level of validity, right? That's a great check mark because that's what the original Restall system wanted to begin with, right? He wanted to come in and show that we could have a pluralism purely at the level of validity, not having to do with a variance and connective meanings. We're good to go there, right? We also argued, or we saw that Ferrari and Orlandelli also admitted a pluralism at the level of connective meanings, right? So you can have all these kind of variations, right? But now we've got a third one. We've got a pluralism at the level of admissibility. Right? As long as you are useful and balanced in some way, right? Some harmonious way, you can get into the system now. So depending on what you pick for harmony, then you're going to wind up with different systems here. So thank you.